History sucks, man. Don't become a communist. It's just disappointing.
It's one disappointment after
make
another.
You feel bad. You just don't do anything but increase your own anguish.
That kind of hurts my heart a little bit,
Sorry.
but it's true.
Yeah. Hey, welcome to Left Unread.
Hello. We are two dudes engaging in radical self-education. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will. We're simply two reluctant Spartacists hiding from the frequently and quickly forming Freikorps in this fascist hellscape.
Unfortunately so. And this week we read
Michael Parenti, Blackshirts and Reds.
That's right.
Yes, just to give you a word on Michael Parenti. He's a New York-born leftist intellectual figure, well known for his fire and brimstone speeches and witty, easy-to-understand writings. He's authored over 25 books critiquing capitalism, power structures, media, and the United States patriotism as a whole. He's remained an ever-prominent figure in the American left even today. After being blackballed from academia, he started touring full-time, and you can find many of his speeches online, including the colloquially The Yellow Speech is really good. Go watch The Yellow Speech. I was actually listening to it on the way here.
Really?
Just, it's so good. It's the one where he goes, the Philippines is rich. Africa is rich. Chile is rich. They're not underdeveloped. They're overexploited. And it's like, ah! He's great. I'm a big Parenti head with one notable exception, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah.
And he's lovely. His other major works, though, include Against Empire, Inventing Reality, and, of course, Blackshirts and Reds.
That is right. And Blackshirts and Reds, seminal text and number one Buddyhead recommended book. Blackshirts and Reds is the 11th book in the repertoire of Michael Parenti, originally published in 1997. Blackshirts and Reds is described by Google Books as a bold and entertaining exploration of the epic struggles of yesterday and today, and by everyone else as an examination of capitalism's all too close relationship to fascism, the perils of left anti-communism, and a ridiculous anecdote about Stalin's fingers. Blackshirts and Reds is a must-read for any aspiring communist.
Yes, it's a really fantastic book. It's also, I think, a great introductory piece for a lot of people, simply because it tackles so many of the kind of anti-communist myths that are out there. One thing that's really refreshing reading this, as opposed to some of the other things we've been reading, is that he's American, right? Everything he talks about is, for the most part, like a reference that I understand, which is quite nice. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I had a great time with this. And shortly after you and I met, I bought this book after you had mentioned something to me about Michael Parenti, because it had always been on like a recommended reading list, and I'd just never gotten around to it. Same with Jakarta Method was another one. And I read the first 4 chapters back then, and at the time I enjoyed it, but I was like, I feel like I should know a little bit more about like the history of fascism and anti-communism in Europe. And rereading it, I have no fucking clue why I thought that and why it stopped me from reading it, because this is like super accessible.
Yeah.
And like you said, written from the perspective of a modern American writer. So yeah, it just totally fits right in my wheelhouse, and I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, he is a fiery writer. I mean, he is zealous. Like it's quite wild the way he talks. It's even better the way he speaks. One nice thing is that there's a considerable amount of overlap between his books and his speeches, obviously. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't feel like reading the book, I highly recommend listening to the speeches. They're all on YouTube. They're even on streaming services if you know where to look. It's not hard. You can just look for the guy's name. But they're not legally on streaming services. In fact, the audiobook is on a streaming service that I didn't have to pay for, because the official version was on the same streaming service, but you did have to pay for it. So it was pretty nice.
Was it the same reader?
It was the same exact audiobook, same cover and everything. Cool. Yeah.
Good.
Nice.
I don't know exactly where to start with this.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do want to say about this being kind of like a nice place to start for people is, right in the preface, exactly how he starts it. He just says that this book invites those immersed in the prevailing orthodoxy to entertain iconoclastic views. Just to step outside of like your own box of comfort for a moment. Because I think for a non-indoctrinated listener, a listener with no familiarity with the kind of things we're talking about, it can be really uncomfortable to kind of entertain these views, maybe even like a little taboo. So don't know. I really thought this was a nice piece, and I could see myself recommending this to somebody. I don't know if it would be like too abrasive, maybe, for them to read just right off the cuff. I'm thinking just like an average normie.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a little bit because I do think that this is a book that you could recommend to someone that's not already a communist, and they could get something out of it, and they wouldn't immediately be afraid of it based on whatever indoctrination they have found. You know, if you talk about Lenin to the wrong people, they're just immediately shut off to it. And they, one, probably don't even know who Parenti is, because for whatever reason, even though in the circles that he ran in, he was a very well-known academic, he didn't, like some of his contemporaries like Chomsky, for example, like find a way to leave that sphere and create an influence that went beyond that. So I think a lot of people don't know who he is. And I think though he does write in a very zealous way, I don't think that would immediately put off like a normie reader.
Yeah, that's fair. One thing that it comes from his book Dirty Truth, which I haven't read, but he was blackballed apparently from academia because he took part in a protest and was arrested for it. And so basically, he was more or less like blacklisted from being a professor, and that's when he decided to do political speaking full time. Yeah. So, you know, that's a common parallel that I hear is between Michael Parenti and Noam Chomsky, even though they have, you know, pretty different fields overall, but it's mostly because they both have they did parallel thinking. They had the same fucking book where Noam Chomsky had manufactured consent, and Parenti has Inventing Reality, which I think came earlier. I'm not going to fact check myself right now. He also hates Noam Chomsky.
He does take a few shots at him.
There's quite many. In fact, some really funny ones. I don't know if you caught, but there's a part where he says he's quoting Chomsky, and Chomsky says the Russian counter-revolution, and Parenti puts sick next to it. So petty. I love it. Sorry to get ahead of myself there, but that was so fucking funny. And fuck Noam Chomsky anyway. The more I learn about him, the less I like him.
Yeah, you know, what's funny is usually when I'm going through the books, I'll write little notes to myself about like topics or ideas that I have while I'm reading it. And one of them was about Chomsky. And I think like Chomsky was an important figure in my political development when I was first becoming politically aware around the turn of the century as I was a teenager. I read, I think Hegemony or Survival was the first of his books that I read. A few years after that, Failed States came out and I read that. And it was an important part of my political development. I don't know another way to say it. But the more that I learned about Chomsky over time, the more I found him to be one of these like left anti-communists.
Yeah.
And the more I've learned about him in the last few years and his bestie, Epstein, I've had a hard time swallowing quite a lot of that. So
I don't know how far that relationship really went. I actually have no idea, but it is very funny to me that came out. I don't know. The thing that always stood out to me was when they were talking about, this was back in was this in 2016? This must have been in 2020. There was like a big debate about vote blue no matter who. And I saw Noam Chomsky on an interview where the person was like, don't you think that voting blue no matter who leads to this like slow decline? You know, and Noam Chomsky was just like, 96 years old, adamantly going like, it takes 2 seconds to vote for not Donald Trump. And the interviewer kept trying to be like, that's not really what we're asking, It was awful. So I and then all the Epstein stuff came out. So, yeah. I mean, I like some things about where he says, like, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. That's nice. Let's move on from Noam Chomsky. This isn't what we're fucking talking about here. We're talking about Mike Parenti.
Yeah. So this is one of those situations because it's not a text of theory per se. It's more of like a perspective on history is maybe the way to put it, which I found very refreshing and very entertaining to read. But I don't exactly know where to begin. The only idea that I have is that I've been thinking a lot about the state as we've been doing this show together.
Okay.
Because, I came into this probably with more anarchist leanings than certainly than you and than a lot of people that call themselves communists would ever admit to. And that's because I have like a strong skepticism of the corrupting power of the state, of influence that comes with that sort of position. And so I've been thinking about the state a lot. And the deeper we get into this, the more assured I am that the state is necessary even beyond the moment of a revolution. So I think like you obviously need the leadership of a state in order to be organized enough to create and participate in a revolution, to sustain that revolution, because it's not just one happy day, like we said in Luxembourg.
Right.
And I feel more and more assured of that. And I had that thought a lot while I was reading this. I even wrote notes to myself a couple of times about quotes, things that Parenti said that made me feel more assured in that position.
Sure.
So maybe that's a place to start.
Yeah, okay. I like that. One thing that Parenti does here is he does a lot to defend actually existing socialisms, which I'm quite fond of. We had the whole discussion about, are they socialist? Are they socialist? There was a bit of debate that we had going on there. And I think that some of the sentiment that we had then is echoed in this book, where he's saying, like, the existence of this alternative is what makes it socialist, not necessarily that it's like the people have the means of production in their control or whatever. And that's an interesting idea that certainly has to do with the state.
I wrote 3 notes to myself, all from the chapter called Left Anti-Communism. It also happens to be the exact page where Parenti does his little Chomsky burn with the sick quote.
Sick, so fucking
on the top
funny,
of page
dude.
47. He is quoting Chomsky there. And Chomsky is basically saying Leninism is the doctrine that says the radical intelligentsia have a right to take state power. Parenti's response is, here Chomsky fashions an image of power-hungry intellectuals to go along with his cartoon image of power-hungry Leninists, villains seeking not the revolutionary means to fight injustice, but power for power's sake. When it comes to red bashing, some of the best and brightest on the left sound not much better than the worst on the right. And I just thought that was a good representation of the conflict with the state, and also a reasonable response to it. That I think Chomsky's position, and perhaps my position when I was first encountering this question, or where that skepticism about the state came from, is that, like, there is a corruptive power in the state that will turn pretty much anyone, has the ability to turn pretty much anyone that participates at that level into an authoritarian or whatever it is.
Sure.
But I think, like, Parenti's response is that the assumption of that belief is that the people seeking those positions are doing so because they're power hungry, not because they recognize the power as the means of seizing that position, if that makes any sense. So the state being a tool, not an office, so to speak. And I think, I don't know, that made me feel a little bit more comfortable framing it in that sort of way, thinking of it like that. Like what we read of Lenin, I don't imagine Lenin as some sort of power-hungry dude.
Yeah.
I think he took the position that he took in Russia because he recognized that that apparatus needed a centralized organizational leadership that was going to make things happen. Not because he was like, finally, my chance.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think, like, I feel more comfortable with that notion now.
Well, there's one thing that Parenti says that I love is, it's actually on page 43, just a couple pages before, where he says, some leftists and others fall back on the old stereotype of power-hungry Reds who pursue power for power's sake. If true, one wonders why, in country after country, these Reds side with the poor and powerless, often at great risk and sacrifice to themselves, rather than reaping the rewards that come with serving the well-placed.
Yep.
It goes back to that kind of parallel that Parenti's talking about in the beginning of this book, where he's saying that it's easier for people to associate communism and fascism with the same things because they view them both as totalitarian measures, even though they're confusing the form with the essence, I think is what he says.
Yeah.
And it's that exact thing. It's like, there is a power-seeking portion of it, but it's like, what is the goal of that power? They are, in fact, looking for power, but the goal is not to wield power. It's to use that power to do something. Just like you said, how it's a tool.
Yeah.
It's exactly that same thing. And it's also that double standard. I mean, I'm jumping into a billion different topics right here, but how a communist can do no right if they are supporting the low class. It's only to beguile these masses into supporting their power hungry objective or whatever. I don't know. It's part of like this whole double standard that's held on communists. Basically, there's a lot that Parenti does here where I don't know. I hate like hypocrisy rhetoric. That's not my favorite thing in the world. But there's many times here where Parenti will make a parallel between, like, why isn't anyone condemning the Democratic Party for all the things that they've done, but we must condemn the Communist Party for all the things they've done? Where it seems like once I'll read it and I'll be like, oh yeah, that is a total double standard. But you would never think of that because we're so enmeshed in one side of the standard, That happens a lot in this book. Another Noam Chomsky dig. Thus, Noam Chomsky claims the rise of corporations was in fact a manifestation of the same phenomena that led to fascism and Bolshevism, which sprang out of the same totalitarian soil. And then Parenti says, But in Italy and Germany of that day, most workers and peasants made a firm distinction between fascism and communism, as did industrialists and bankers who supported fascism out of the fear and hatred of communism, a judgment based largely on class realities.
Yep.
That might be something that we're quick to accept, but the regular person is not, is that fascism is a rational institution. It's an institution that's born out of the class reality of the day. I love the way that Parenti talks about fascism in the beginning of this book, because he's very clear that it's not just like the crazy occult image of the Nazis, like worshiping the like ancient Valhalla Aryans, and they have like Nordic runes and like dark occult magic and shit. It's like, no, man, they were really just men who were being supported by money, and they used that power to then support the industrial interests. And, every little fucking weird, eccentric thing that they do is just a means of class control. It's a means of class subjugation. I think that aspect might be really obvious to us, but like to a layman, perhaps it's like, oh shit, you know what? Fascism is just like, it's not a moral aberration. It's a rational explanation. It's a rational conclusion.
Yeah, that's the first chapter, right? Rational
fascism. I mean, it's in the subtitle. I mean, he argues that in a lot of things. Fascism is a rational institution. Racism is a rational institution. All of the isms.
It's not that I condone fascism, or any ism for that matter. Isms, in my opinion, are not good.
Identity politics as it is, he kind of rails against a little bit. Not in that they're not valid, but that they are, missing the interlinking, interconnecting fiber between all of them,
Yeah.
If we want to talk about a totalitarian soil in which everything is springing forth from, it's like those are the institutions of capitalism here that we're talking about.
I'm glad that you brought up the identity politics thing. I mean, he doesn't really come back to that until the very end of the book, but I thought that was really interesting, fascinating stuff. I'd like to jump back there.
Yeah, I know exactly the page it's on. It's on 133, 135, and then also on 151. That's when he talks about identity politics. That might be the big one.
I think that's the one I was
looking for. Where
yeah.
he says, like, they've devolved into these identity-based things. It's like, if you're... One thing that Michael Parenti talks about is ABC theorists, anything but class. It goes in that thread of left anti-communism, but leftists that are willing to find every possible explanation except for the explanation, And that thinking is leading to all of these, like, I don't want to say half-assed, but like, half steps, right? Like identity politics gets half of the way there because it does acknowledge a crucial aspect of the fucking hellscape that we live in. It's just that it's missing the other half, the class half.
Yeah, and I think in large part it's recognizing a symptom and not recognizing the cause, And so it's like an awareness of the effect, but not an awareness of the instigator. I don't know. Yeah, and that ABC intellectuals on 151, he says, it says little for left ABC intellectuals when they can be outclassed by establishment people like Rosenthal and Rohatyn.
I have no idea.
Seizing upon anything but class, U.S. leftists today have developed an array of identity groups centering around ethnic, gender, cultural, and lifestyle issues. They treat their respective grievances as something apart from the class struggle and have almost nothing to say about the increasingly harsh politico-economic class injustices perpetuated against us all. People may not develop a class consciousness, but they are still affected by the power, privileges, and handicaps related to the distribution of wealth and want. These realities are not canceled out by race, gender, or culture.
Yeah.
So even if we could somehow, in a vacuum, isolate these issues, identity markers that we identify with identity politics, and like somehow, quote, solve racism or solve gender inequality or something like that, there's no way to do that without acknowledging the impact of class struggle, and shit's still going to be whack.
Yeah. It makes me think of fucking like Malcolm Gladwell writing these books, like finding these weird explanations, these weird connections between all these things, like, oh, here's all the outlier cases, and it's like, maybe there's a common thread that's running through all of these,
right.
I mean, the same thing with like fucking Freakonomics. When I was a kid, I loved Freakonomics because I was an idiot, and now it's like, this is just capitalism laid bare, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, like to that point about like, even if you could isolate some sort of one of these like isms and work very diligently toward trying to solve that problem. I think on page 149, he uses this.
This is exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
Because he says the feminist revolution that was going to transform our entire patriarchal society has thus far not materialized, yet no progressive person takes this to mean that sexism is a chimera or that gender-related struggles are of no great moment.
Yeah.
So it's like we can identify that there is this issue, there is this inequality, there is this struggle that needs to take place, but we haven't been able to transform it because we're not looking at the underlying root cause.
Yeah, I still love. I mean, that's just a great analogy. Anyway, is just like nobody's trying to discard feminism because we still have the patriarchy, right? But people are still trying to discard Marxism because we still have a class issue.
Yeah,
right. Even the next line, that workers in the United States are not throwing up barricades, does not mean the class struggle is a myth.
Exactly.
And I mean, we've seen this current in a bunch of the texts we've read so far, at least a few of them, where people are saying that Marxism is old hat. And it's like that is a means of control. It's like, don't look at this answer here. It's not the answer you're looking for. Just discard that. Maybe it worked in the old days. You're thinking too economically or whatever. Like we're in a new postmodern.
Fuck that shit.
Dude, I actually I didn't mark it down, but it's in the end there. You can tell that Michael Parenti is really fucking fed up with that kind of discourse because he says, ABC theorists see the working class as not only incapable of revolution, but as on the way out, declining in significance as a social formation. Anyone who still thinks class is of primary importance is labeled a die-hard Marxist, guilty of economism and reductionism, unable to keep up with the post-Marxist, post-structuralist, post-industrialist, post-capitalist, post-modernist, and post-deconstructionist times. Yeah, you can tell he's fed the fuck up.
Post everything.
Yeah.
Across generations, stolen labor and shattered lives. Let's end this exploitation. Give the benefit their bottom line. Endless accumulation.
The hell that is after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's like some really fucking crazy stuff in here that he's talking about. Here's one thing I just have to address right off the bat, okay? Where are the sources, man? Like, he does cite a lot of things in this book, but many, many things he does not, okay? And I get that this is not like an academic book. It's like pop history, but there's some stuff in here that's crazy. Like when he's talking about the fall of communism, right, in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, he quotes a Newsweek article where he's like, one journalist found stacks of child pornography in the Estonian parliament. And I'm like, did they? Did they really find stacks? Come on. And the thing is, that is one that he has cited. And I went and looked at the Newsweek article and there's nothing there. It's just like that block quote is in there, I don't know. I wish he was a little more cited. That's just one thing I'll say there.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't find that to be much of a hindrance for my reading through it. Perhaps I'm just a shill and I'm just going along with everything that he's saying. But like the stuff about Russia in particular and the modern world at the time of his writing, with like Boris Yeltsin and stuff like that, there was a lot of stuff in there that I was like, okay, I don't know, maybe.
I'm reading Collapse right now about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And particularly about how fucking Gorbachev is like a useless idiot. That's a crazy one. I don't think we will be able to read it for this, but it is a fucking insane book. Gorbachev describes himself as a neo-Leninist, and he loves reading Lenin. He's one of those guys that's like, Lenin had the perfect worker state solution, and then Stalin came and mucked everything up. And then in his attempt to apply those ideas, he obliterates the Soviet economy. He fucking annihilates it. He's a liberal. He's a fucking idiot. Anyway, just had to get my rant off about Gorbachev there because I'm not going to get any moment to otherwise. The reason I bring that up, though, is because it's clear even in the time that Yeltsin is not a democratic person. He's a right populist figure who is content on opportunistically seizing power. He has no interest in democracy. So I don't know, like the first time I read some of this, there were some wild claims and I was like, there's no way this shit is true. Now that I've gone back, maybe I've just entrenched myself more heartedly so, but now that I'm going back, it's like, damn, this is like the third or fourth place I'm seeing these same claims, they've got to be true, right? It's one of those fucking weird things about history where the truth is stranger than the fiction, right? It's like the history that we're taught is so fucking wrong in so many ways. Actually digging into it can just fucking blow everything up.
Yeah, it's certainly not always a rational or logical thing.
Yeah.
It's fucking wild sometimes. I think we should go through your topics. Let's go through each one.
Sure. I feel we're having a hard time on this one a little bit.
Yeah, well, this always happens when we read something that's not theory. I feel like we don't have that as the like kind of thread that leads us through the conversation for dissecting that. And so it's like, yeah, it was entertaining. Yeah, I agree with that.
Cool.
But
well, okay, we talked a little bit about rational fascism already. I think I pretty much covered all of my quotes. The only thing here is the well-trodden idea at this point that if you scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds.
Yeah.
I really love the way Rosa Luxemburg said it. I mean, it's not that socialism is reliant on democracy, but that democracy is reliant on socialism. Democracy is a superfluous institution. It's not one that is required for our system. Not our system like the one we're trying to develop, but the system that is currently inhabiting our Earth. Democracy is not required for that. There's something he says on page 21. He says, well, first off, he talks about some conspiracy stuff here. We haven't discussed any of the things that happened in Italy besides that one time where I said the Italian political history is fucking insane. But I love on page 20 where, first off, he's talking about Gladio, P2, Propaganda Due. There were like actual secret societies meant to entrench conservative leadership into Italy, which is so strange because, I'm curious, didn't they have an issue with conservatism in like the middle of the last century?
Hey, Mussolini was a socialist.
God. I know we're going backwards, but I love the example right in the beginning where he's like, I went and saw a fucking Mussolini t-shirt. I see fucking Nazi fan cams, dude, like on Twitter. It's like, just a casual black sun in that photo. It's like, I don't need any of this stuff in my life, dude. What the fuck are you guys smoking? Here's a crazy problem that I've run into recently. I think I might have talked about this before, but I've been listening to a lot of Irish music because it's really fun. And Spotify has taken the liberty of cycling in some Rhodesian music, some Rhodesian anthems into my playlist as well. And it's like, I understand the connection that you, Spotify, are making algorithmically here, but it's definitely not what I'm looking for, Suddenly a song like The Great White Tribe will come on and I'm like, the what now? Yeah. Excuse me? Why did I make that point? I don't fucking remember.
Sorry, we were on the strategy attention stuff with Italy.
Yeah, it's because fascism is still fucking alive and true, man. It's still everywhere. That strategy of tension that they're talking about there is a fucking insane part of history that if you start talking about it to the average person, they're going to think you're a crazy conspiracy theorist. Yeah, because it's literally like Illuminati-type cabal shit. Okay, stay behind armies just in case the communists take over. It's like sleeper cells, dude. This is the kind of stuff you read in a Tom Clancy novel, not in a fucking history textbook. And then he says the objective was, in the strategy of tension, to combat by any means necessary the electoral gains of the Italian Communist Party and create enough fear and terror in the population so as to undermine the multi-party social democracy and replace it with an authoritarian presidential republic and a stronger, more stable executive, which they accomplished, might I add, okay? I'm not too young to know that Silvio Berlusconi was a person and a leader of Italy, and he was a neo-fascist, essentially. I mean, they have fucking Giorgia Meloni in there right now. She's literally part of the neo-fascist party. I know that's not fair to say. Sorry.
I don't have anything to add to that. You read the quote there that I would have picked from that section. I don't know a lot about Italian history specifically. My thoughts about the rational fascism chapter in general. Yeah, number one, before World War I, Mussolini was a socialist, apparently.
Yep. Yeah.
One of those power-hungry ones, I guess, that Parenti says they're not all like that. One thing on this same page, on page 2, actually, in the section Plutocrats Choose Autocrats, he gives this description, a movement composed of black-shirted ex-army officers, and he describes them as having, quote, no clear political doctrine other than a militaristic patriotism and conservative dislike for anything associated with socialism and organized labor. And I just wrote, wow, truck ranters, because it seems very familiar to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to. I don't know. It's like how the KKK is in a terrorist organization. These things, these fucking black shirts are an everyday occurrence in America, but it's part of our American culture. So we just kind of You know, I mean, think of like, what is it, the 2%ers or whatever, all of the different militias that have like sprung onto the scene in the last couple of years.
Like the white replacement theory people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the fucking Proud Boys, you know, those are black shirts. Like that, I mean, even when I was ranting about like the fraternal Freikorps, you know, college students who are willing to go and harass protesters because of some patriotic internal duty. It's like that. Those are the people that we're talking about here. Yeah. The lumpen proletariat, man. Who fucking knows? They're fucked. One thing I thought was really funny on page 5 when Ernst Thälmann is like, voting for Hindenburg is like voting for Hitler. Then the bourgeois press said that this view was Moscow inspired. Yeah. Another lovely modern parallel I thought of.
Also, the very next paragraph, he says, true to form, the Social Democrat leaders refused the Communist Party's proposal to form an 11th hour coalition against Nazism.
Yes. I've heard this is why I've heard social democracy, you know, described as the progressive wing of fascism, right? It all comes back to Reagan, man. Fucking Ronald Reagan.
I mean, doesn't everything?
Yeah, right.
Isn't that the Boondocks joke?
Yeah. I love this is later, but I love when he's talking about George H.W. Bush preaching nonviolence to Nelson Mandela as they're actively invading Panama.
Yeah, right.
You know? Every time I read another book, I learn about another U.S. intervention, okay? In 1965, we sent like 12,000 Marines to the Dominican Republic. Nobody told me that.
Yeah.
You know, that's crazy.
I will say there was some interesting stuff. I don't remember where it was. You probably have a better memory of it than me. Where he's basically going through the list.
Yeah, the list.
We talked about it in the Jakarta method.
List. I wrote it down because he says it's a free market holocaust. Yeah. It's essentially an expanded version of the list that we read in Jakarta. Here we go. It's on page 25.
Oh, shit. I was
just a couple pages away. In the pursuit of counter-revolution and in the name of freedom, America. The U.S. forces or U.S.-supported surrogate forces slaughtered 2 million North Koreans, 3 million Vietnamese, 500,000 in aerial wars over Laos and Cambodia, 1.5 million in Angola, 1 million in Mozambique, 500,000 in Afghanistan, 500,000 to 1 million in Indonesia, 200,000 in East Timor, 100,000 in Nicaragua, combining the Somoza and Reagan eras, over 100,000 in Guatemala, plus an additional 40,000 disappeared, 700,000 in Iraq, over 60,000 in El Salvador, 30,000 in the dirty war of Argentina, although the government only admits to 9, 35,000 in Taiwan when the Kuomintang military arrived from China, 20,000 in Chile, and many thousands in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Western Sahara, Zaire, Turkey, and dozens of other countries in what amounts to free market world holocaust.
Yeah, free market world holocaust. What a fucking phrase. And he elaborates on it a little bit there, but for all the folks that rally against communism and bring up the death toll, number one, the numbers are absurd that they try to throw out that 100 million figure at you all the time or whatever. But like, look at the fucking death toll that we're talking about here. And this is talking about U.S. intervention, not even talking about like British intervention, British capitalist intervention like in India. And he is talking about this in response to the, quote, implacable communist foe, and says that despite repeated and often factitious references to the tyranny of the Red Menace, the anti-communist opinion makers never spelled out what communists actually did in the way of socioeconomic policy. They still cannot offer an informed statement about the social policies of communist societies.
I mean, it's by design. You know, they keep the definition of communism loose so they can apply it to anybody. That's something that Parenti talks about multiple times here, even on the very next page. From opposing communists because they might be revolutionaries, it's a short step to opposing revolutionaries because they might be communists. The real sin of revolutionaries, communist or not, was that they championed the laboring classes against the wealthy few. They advocated changes in the distribution of class power and the way wealth was produced and used. They wanted less individualist advancements at the expense of many and collective betterment for the entire working populace.
That quote that you started with, from opposing communists because they might be revolutionaries to opposing revolutionaries because they might be communists, is
real.
It is real. Yeah. It is like frightening, and it just like hits really fucking hard, man.
The historical example is Cuba, because they were not communists when they started, right? Khrushchev very famously said that I think he said it to whoever the president was, JFK, I guess. I don't know. That's a problem. I know a bit of history and none of the detail. You know, I feel like an idiot sometimes talking out of my ass. Anyway, aside from that, this is a true fact. Khrushchev said that Castro was not a communist, but you'll make a great communist of him. You know, that's what he says to the U.S. He's like, you will make communists of Castro yet because you're fucking idiots. You know, and that's so true. Like all he wanted, even in Jakarta Method, we saw this happen, right? Where not communist leaders, they simply are. Even as Parenti describes here, right, nationalists with reform-minded nationalists is what he says. People that aren't communists, they're just vaguely left-leaning. You know, they want reformist measures. They want redistributive measures. They challenge the interests of capital and then are destroyed. They're labeled as communists. They're labeled as Soviet puppets, and then they're obliterated. You know, I mean, you see the same thing even today with, like, Chinese agents, right? I think that the call of Chinese influence is the same thing happening today.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I don't know. I feel like my take on this thing is like pretty elementary, as is typical, but like there's this slippery slope in that sort of rationale that you oppose communism because it's revolutionary, and then you go to opposing revolutions or revolutionaries because they might be communists is a quick way to turn it around and weaponize it and make it very easy to weaponize even non-communist thinkers, even non-communist actors, and use that as a like wide casting net to not only kind of water down the message, the definition of what communism even is, by the way, not only watering that down, but also like looping people in that are a fucking far cry from communists. It's like absurd that to hear people on the right in the United States call the Democrats fucking communists. And it's like, I fucking wish they were communists, man. Like, if that's what gets you called a communist, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I was thinking about that earlier because I said that Michael Parenti is a leading, a prominent leftist intellectual, and it's like, how many of those are there? If you ask the average American if they can name one, the answer is no. I mean,
they'd probably name like Bernie. Or something
that's
like
the thing. It's like, what's the most progressive person you can name? Is probably fucking Bernie Sanders, right? And yeah, he is a progressive person, but in the grand scheme of things, he's not. He's not that fucking radical.
No, he certainly doesn't act as a radical in the position that he's in.
Yeah. In fact, him and Michael Parenti, Bernie Sanders and Michael Parenti were good friends up until Bernie Sanders supported the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, and Michael Parenti did not.
Yeah.
So
we should talk about Yugoslavia. You even said in the last episode you've got a Yugoslavia story.
Well, okay, yeah. Let's just start there, man. I 2 summers ago I was into book binding. I wanted to bind a book, and I was just kind of looking around, and I downloaded Michael Parenti's Yugoslavia book, which is called To Kill a Nation. And he makes some interesting points in there, some of which he does also kind of make in this book, which we can tie to. But he does horrid genocide denial. He basically does both sides. Both. He wants to play both sides. Is what I'm trying to say. And I think this isn't really relevant, but I think that at the time of writing, he might have seen the circumstance a specific way, thinking in an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist worldview that led him maybe to say those things, but now that we're like 30 years out, haven't held up. So I just wanted to preface this by saying you don't need to read Michael Parenti's Yugoslavia book. There are other books about Yugoslavia that are probably better. But an interesting point that he makes in that book and also in this book is the idea that these countries were destroyed so they could be taken under the wing of imperialism. They could be taken under the wing of capitalism. This is in the section Free Market Paradise Goes East, where he's talking about the hellish, ghoulish world of Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of communism. Okay, this is just at the top of 102. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies. They seem more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. They complained about how work was taken over their lives. One has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself, only time for making money. These countries were obliterated by bombing, and the only thing that they had left was essentially the capital that was penetrating their country from like foreign markets, foreign capitals and things. And Parenti talks about kind of a neo-colonization of these countries in this book, which I think is really...
Yeah, that's kind of just like Parenti's thing. They're not underdeveloped, they're overexploited, right?
2 things I want to talk about. One, what came before the revolution? That's a great point that fucking Michael Parenti makes. which I'll find a quote for in a second. There's a great bit, though, where he's like, we talk about communism destroying freedoms, and it's like, look at the freedoms that existed in these places where revolution happened before revolution.
He says they'll find any association with communist organizations morally unacceptable because of the crimes of communism.
This is the quote I was talking about earlier, where it says, yet many of them are themselves associated with the Democratic Party, either as voters or members, unconcerned about their morally unacceptable political crimes committed by leaders of the Democratic organization. Under one or another Democratic administration, 120,000 Japanese Americans were torn from their home, You know, it's like, political repression is bad when it's done by the communists, but it's okay when it's done by us.
Yeah.
Note that we're not repressing any of the fascists, though. We're just repressing more communists.
I came up with a phrase. This is totally unrelated.
Yeah.
But in one of his footnotes, he tells a story about Trotsky.
Yes.
And I wrote, why Stalinists hate Trotsky. And then
I highlighted that one, too.
I came up with a phrase, not hot to trot.
Not hot to trot. Have you seen his fucking leather uniform?
No.
He was a leather daddy.
Oh,
he loved it. Yeah, Trotsky's personal guard all wore full leather suits, man.
Goodness.
Like in Indiana Jones, like how the Nazis have like the leather fucking just like that. It's insane. I don't know why. It's because he was a freak. He was a little
leather daddy,
freak.
dude. Yeah.
Dude, when he was exiled to Mexico, he openly flirted with fucking what's her name? Frida Kahlo
you said,
in front of his wife because she didn't speak any fucking Spanish. Yeah.
That's a scumbag move.
He's a shit, okay? Like we said, Trotsky, no riz, no bitches, bitch made. All right.
Taking children from the rubble, loving on the app with the third theater of war. But nearly under the struggle, blinded by the Zionist imperial guard.
U.S. policymakers argue that social revolutionary victory anywhere represents a diminution of freedom in the world. The assertion is false. The Chinese Revolution did not crush democracy. There was none to crush in that oppressively feudal regime. The Cuban Revolution did not destroy freedom. It destroyed a hateful U.S.-sponsored police state. The Algerian Revolution did not abolish national liberties. Precious few existed under French colonialism. The Vietnamese revolutionaries did not abrogate individual rights. No such rights were available under the U.S.-supported peppermint governments of Bao Dai, Diem, and Cai. Okay? Of course, revolutions do limit the freedoms of the corporate propertied class and other privileged interests.
Yeah, I think it's so funny because we have a tendency to highlight right before and after one another. Like, I have that whole paragraph
Oh my God.
marked because I think that that's so great. That mention of the Chinese Revolution, it did not crush democracy because there was none to crush to begin with. Of course, revolutions do limit the freedoms of the corporate property class and other privileged interests. Those freedoms that are being limited, the freedom to invest privately without regard to human and environmental costs, the freedom to live in obscene opulence while paying workers starvation wages, the freedom to treat the state as a private agency in the service of a privileged coterie, the freedom to employ child labor and child prostitutes, the freedom to treat women as chattel, and so on. That's just so fucking good. And where's the lie? I don't like that's
There's no comment we can make here because he says it so fucking succinctly on the page. It's like
beautiful.
Yeah. Read the book. Just end the episode there, man. No. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. You know, it's like read this book, read a bunch of other histories, and then realize that the progressive force is the progressives. Surprise, surprise. Like, the communists are left. They're the left wing. Like, that's, you know, they're advocating for these mass rights. I mean, I don't know. It's frustrating because I know that it's like deaf ears, you know?
Yeah, well, and maybe this will segue into the left anti-communism stuff or just anti-communism in general, but I think that that's a lot of where the kind of rhetoric comes from and that like shift from oppressing communists because they're revolutionaries to oppressing revolutionaries because they're communists. What that does is it shifts the rhetoric to a point where like all of that malarkey about like we live in freedom, we have freedom here, communists are totalitarian authoritarians that like seek to take your freedom away. Sounds like it coming straight out of Stalin's mouth, like shit like that. That is completely blind to the idea that like there are things like exactly what he's saying here. The freedoms that we're talking about are the freedoms to exploit people.
It's on the page before. I always think of freedom isn't free because it's a dumb saying, but
There's a hefty fucking fee.
Yeah, it's not. That's not the point. First off, what that saying means is something totally different, but it just cracks me up because I'm like, it's not freedom actually when you think about it.
Yeah.
But he says here, this is the bottom of 35. There's no such thing as freedom in the abstract. There's freedom to speak openly and iconoclastically, freedom to organize a political opposition, freedom of opportunity to get an education and pursue a livelihood, freedom to worship as one chooses, da 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 da. Most of what is called freedom gets its definition within a social context. It's like the freedoms that were guaranteed here are not necessarily freedoms in like the ideal sense. There's a part where where somebody is interviewed in a former communist country and he's like, what freedoms have we gained? The freedom to buy porno, It's like, what's free is not really free. Freedom is a flexible definition.
Yeah. And the idea that there are freedoms that are, quote, guaranteed to us is a good indication of that. The idea that it is flexible and abstract, because those, quote, guarantees are pretty fucking soft.
Yeah, no joke.
This is also the same part where he's talking about George Bush Sr. preaching peace to Nelson Mandela on page 34. Mandela's real sin in Bush's eyes was that he was part of a revolutionary movement that engaged in armed struggle against a violent, repressive apartheid regime in South Africa. Bush's capacity for selective perception had all the unexamined audacity of a dominant ideology that condemns only those who act against an unjust status quo, not those who use violence to preserve it.
I can't stand George Herbert Walker Bush. First off, he killed Kennedy. Let's just put that out there.
I knew you were going to say that.
He killed Kennedy. Where was he?
He's the only one that won't say where he was.
Everybody in this fucking world remembers where they were on the day JFK was shot, except a guy who was in the same city. Come on.
Suspect.
Don't fucking fool yourself. Don't fucking fool yourself. But he was also a piece of shit. In Collapse, he's like, first off, dude, this is how I know Gorbachev was not a real one, because he was best fucking buddies with a bunch of conservative world leaders. He loved Margaret Thatcher. He loved George Bush, and he loved Reagan too. Not loved, but he consulted with them frequently and would talk about the problems of the Soviet Union to kind of workshop solutions with them. It's like, what kind of solutions do you think you were really getting from George H.W. Bush?
Let's talk about siege socialism.
Siege socialism. The way that Parenti puts it that I think is the best is when he says the revolutionary baby was strangled in the crib. This is something we've talked about many times now, but the communism that was at the end of the Soviet Union was a different kind of communism. It's literally a socialism that was formed as a reaction to other things, and I think Parenti does a great job here. So, first off, whether we call the former communist countries socialist is a matter of definition. Suffice it to say they constituted something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world, as the capitalists themselves were not slow to recognize. One thing I want to say here is that a lot of people talk about the military budget being a reason that the Soviet Union was economically strangled. Yeah. What I've been reading recently has kind of shifted my perspective on that. They say if you're an historian with one book, so this is one book. I can't really say it's like an in-depth study or anything, but Vladislav Zubak makes it pretty clear that the military-industrial economy was like a gem of the Soviet economy. It was a major factor, not a constraint. Okay? One thing that was a huge issue in the budget was their social services. And it's not that that's a bad thing, right? But 60% of the USSR budget was on social services and entitlements. That's a fuck ton, okay? That's more than we spend today, which I know is a low bar, okay? The U.S. spends like 45 to 50% of their budget, so, just to give you some comparison there. But, I mean, these are things that they even took for granted, as you can see. I mean, it's like, it makes me think of the fucking Medicare for All debate when Bernie was like, yeah, your taxes will go up, but think of all the costs you won't have to pay. You know, nobody's thinking of those extra costs because they've already taken them under the wing. You know, it's like your insurance premiums, your deductibles, all the shit you have to pay out of pocket. It's like that stuff would be gone. Yeah, you might pay $100 extra on your taxes or whatever, but you know, it's the same thing here. It's like there are some maybe flaws that are prevalent, which Parenti is happy to talk about, you know, disincentives for production and different things like that in the Soviet Union. But the benefits were huge. I mean, you know, even talking about what came before the revolution, it's like the Soviet Union was made into a superpower in 20 years.
Yeah.
Okay, in 30 years. Even though I think, obviously, Parenti's acting with some hindsight here, he says very clearly, he's like, had they taken an alternative path, they would not have been able to withstand the Nazis, you know? And that is an ideological reason. Stalin was in the context of, he was still in the context of the imperialist paradigm, okay? He was convinced that there could not be coexistence between socialism and imperialism, that the capitalist system would be forced to attack socialism. And so that's what they built the military industrial complex on. One, perhaps as a means of repression, sorry. But secondly, because he was convinced that the world was going to invade, okay? That's a bit of history that I have no knowledge of. Michael Parenti says here in the 20s that 14 countries invaded the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Nobody told me that.
Yeah,
What
I
the
was unaware
fuck?
of all
Yeah,
that as well,
dude.
yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy because I'm not saying we're studying Russian history or anything here, but we've been working around that time period in Russian history and we haven't heard anything about that.
Yeah, it seems weird that mum's the word.
Right. You know, maybe that's a result of where we are in the world right now, but I'm going to have to do some deeper digging into that. I'm really kicking myself that I'm not further into Collapse, because then I could comment more on his end of the Soviet Union stuff, you know?
Yeah. Well, at near the end of the book, Parenti gets to talking about formerly socialist countries, and he is basically saying the same sort of thing that you're talking about with the Medicare for All thing. It's like we take for granted all of the things that we have, and all these folks are like, we did exactly that. We took for granted all of the things that we were afforded and realized that our life is worse now.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, this is too general of a phrase, but I think that maybe a thread that Parenti gets at here is that the people in the communist countries didn't understand capitalism and they didn't understand communism either. Yeah. You know, the old guard was gone. Nobody was there that remembered what was before, right? They only saw the context of what they had and then the greener grass. Okay. And of course they went for the greener grass.
The greener grass being access to goods outside of their country.
Yeah. The freedom to buy a porno mag, right? You know, not a fucking healthcare system or whatever, you know. I mean, God, even the basic stuff like, he doesn't say it here. He mentions the same guy. In the Yellow Speech, Michael Parenti talks about going to Cuba before the revolution and seeing how infrastructure was only built to support capitalism. Like, there would be roads built going from the farm to the refinery and the refinery to the port, but the town outside of all that, dirt, you know? And it's like, it's the same fucking thing, you know?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I guess I'm still seeing like a connection here with that kind of malarkey where you get from people that are talking about like, communism means no freedom or whatever, or like they just want to tax you to death and all that sort of shit. And on page 49, right after the quote that you read there, where he's saying that socialist countries were at the very least something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world, he kind of goes through a list of ways that they were different. And he says, first, in communist countries, there was less economic inequality than under capitalism.
Yeah.
So that's what your precious freedom to buy porno gets you is a higher wealth inequality. You know what I mean? He says, secondly, on the next page, productive forces were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment. Public ownership of the means of production supplanted private ownership. And I love the way he ends that paragraph. He says, the income spread between highest and lowest earners in the Soviet Union was about 5-1. In the United States, the spread in yearly income between the top multi-billionaires and the working poor is more like 10,000-1. And this was in 1997 when he wrote this book. It has only gotten worse.
Yeah, not even there, too. Also, there's some numbers in the end where he's like, you know, the spread between a janitor and the top person is like 17,000 or some shit.
Yeah.
Again, just because workers aren't throwing up the barricades doesn't mean that Marxism is outdated. It is ever more topical.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And again, I think like that kind of the rhetoric around using words like communist or Marxist or something like that. You see memes like this all the time online where it's like, talking about the tenets of communism or Marxism or whatever. And then it's like actually using the word Marxism or communism and you see the turn in the person, right? Where it's like the Drake meme or whatever. And I really think that that's true. I think there is an underlying openness to class consciousness, but there's a lack of education and our understanding of the way these systems, economic and political systems, interact that stops us from moving forward with it on a larger scale, in large part because of the sorts of things that he's talking about in the book and the way that communism has been kind of weaponized.
Yeah. I mean, it's a dirty word, I remember when Bernie was running, I was like, he's not going to win because everyone thinks he's a communist. There's too much Cold War paranoia left over.
Yeah.
I think of my uncle, dude. He's like, Obama's a Marxist because he studied under Saul Alinsky. And it's like, neither of those people are communists.
Yeah.
I
will say something I've noticed on TikTok lately is this like push to call oneself a communist.
Yeah.
Like we need to move away from this leftist title.
Yeah.
And just like be real with it. I'm not a leftist, I'm a communist. And,
right.
And say that because we need this like reclamation of what the term means and a clarity around what the term means.
Yeah.
Because 99% of people that call you a communist don't know what communism is. You know what I mean? Anyone that says cultural Marxist is a fuckhead and doesn't understand anything.
Yeah.
And like the idea that we can reclaim that language and use it intentionally to build a stronger counterparty to capitalism. I think that that's got legs.
No, I do agree with you there. I mean, I think that there's definitely some reclamation to be had. It's just because it's about controlling the narrative, right? Like, I think even in the context of like the Democratic and Republican parties, right, the Republicans are quick to control what they're saying. They have the control over the overarching narratives here. And I think that Democrats are quick to give that away. We need to be much more firm in saying like, no, we are communists. We know what communism is. But on the flip side of that, man, I think like 75% of communists don't even know what communism is.
Really?
Yeah. Do I even know what fucking communism is? There's not like I do. At this point, absolutely. But it's not like there's a set definition. There are like pillars that we probably hold to be supporting what communism is, but
sure.
What that communism actually is, I think if you put a definition to it, it's too restraining. Like the other episode when we said like it means that people have the control of the means of production. It's like obviously not. There hasn't been a communism like that yet.
Yeah, and I think that it's aspirational when we define it in that sort of way. And it's an aspiration, like you said, that has never been met. And so it seems disingenuous to say that this is what we are and also say historically that's never been. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I get that all the time. Thinking about Yugoslavia again, it's very strange to, this goes for any communist countries, but Yugo nostalgia is this idea of like, I'm thinking of Yugoslavia and I want that time, even though it had all these problems. You're like glossing over all these issues. And I get this very weird feeling that's like, it's not whether it's wrong or right, because it's probably not right. But is it odd to be nostalgic about something I have no memory of? It's like, I wish this happened. Reading about the Soviet Union is this like crazy wonderland experience. Clearly they had issues, clearly they had cracks, but
certainly
the highest highs are like pipe dream level utopia, Like I saw on Twitter, and this is almost certainly an apocryphal story, but about these guys that went to like the job fair or whatever, and they thought they were getting in the line to be mechanics, but they accidentally got in the line to be doctors, and they were like, I guess we'll be doctors then. It's that kind of thing though. It's like, wow, how fucking egalitarian,
Yeah.
Or did you see Chernobyl, the show?
No, I never watched it.
It's really good.
I didn't have HBO.
Oh yeah. It's like 4 or 5 episodes. Really nice.
I know Jared Harris is in it. I like Jared Harris.
What's so funny, there's a scene where the bureaucrat is there and he's like, I used to be a cobbler and now I run the whole autonomy or whatever. And it's meant to be like this, like, I'm a bureaucrat and I'll keep you down or whatever. But to me, I'm just like, oh shit, nice, man. Like, congratulations. He's supposed to be like a bureaucratic blockade, which he is. But that opportunity was there. I don't know. It's very weird. It's very strange.
You know what's funny though is if you talk to, I find that this comes a lot more in like rural areas where we're at in Ohio and where I grew up and stuff. The folks that I would speak to, they would talk a lot about like they don't trust politicians.
Yeah.
Fair. And they would say like the people that should be running things, and they're always naming just like working class people. And it's because they recognize something in that there is something powerful in having a position of authority and power when you come from a certain stock, when you have a certain lived experience. And it's like weird that we demonize it on one side and idolize it on another. It's just weird.
I mean, I don't know. There's almost this like air of meritocracy in there that I think might not sit well.
I don't know if you know anything about the Vlog Brothers, but
not really.
Hank Green actually.
I do know a little bit, yeah.
He had a video about this a little while ago where it was basically like him responding to all the people that say like, you should run for president. And his response was basically like, no, I shouldn't. I don't know anything about policy. And that was his position. He was like, I want people that are educated in writing laws to be the ones writing the laws. And I do think that there's something valuable in that idea, but it is a very meritocratic kind of idea.
It's so funny, man. Technocracy is the dumbest shit because it's like, we'll put the best people in charge. It's like, yeah, no shit, man. Great. You got the best person for the job. Wow. Every government tries to do that.
Yeah.
You know, that's not a novel idea. Like, of course you want the best people suited for the job. It's just that the governments that say they're doing that are not doing that, you know? The idea of this, like, bureaucracy that's elevating maybe the appropriate people or whatever to positions of power because they're, I don't know, tenured or they're experienced or a lot of things, I think has some merit, no pun intended, but obviously it comes with its own flaws. I mean, when Parenti's talking about the issues with communism here, he's like, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of buddyism, you know, a lot of personal favors. That's the kind of thing that we have to watch out for. But there's still this idea that's like, from the people, you're selecting whoever's suited best, hopefully by a democratic measure, and that person is then elevated to lead. Like, that's not a bad thing. That's the ideal, is it not? Like, I don't know what we're arguing about here.
Yeah. A couple more thoughts from these pages since I have them open.
Okay.
On 51. This section that we started reading from is pure socialism versus siege socialism.
Yeah.
And I think it's Parenti making a pretty good argument to say that ideal that we're talking about, that communist ideal that we are aspiring to but has never come to pass,
right?
You got to let go of that being the only way it's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
There's that and there's the real shit.
There's actual stuff.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important thing for us to remember, keep our feet firmly on the ground, right? Because he says this on the top of 51, unfortunately, this pure socialism view is ahistorical, non-falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the actualities of history. And again, back to that thing that I was saying at the start about the state and my growing acceptance of the necessity of a state apparatus to get us to and through revolution. He says they do not explain how the manifold functions of a revolutionary society would be organized. He's talking about these pure socialists.
Right.
They don't explain that. They don't explain how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, how scarce resources would be allocated, policy differences settled, priorities set, production and distribution conducted. I mean, on the one hand, I do think that sounds a lot like anarchist criticism to me, not just a pure socialist kind of thing. But he's laying out all of the reasons why some form of hopefully democratic, centralized leadership is necessary to deal with all of that shit. Yeah. Because you're not going to exist in a vacuum. Historically, we've seen, just like you said before with Stalin and his paranoia, that if you have a socialist state, you're going to be dealing not only with the internal contradictions and internal conflicts, but all of the external ones that are being brought upon you. And you have to have, I don't know, I really feel like I've come to this conclusion. The state is a necessary, I don't want to call it a necessary evil, but it is a necessary tool in this case. Hopefully it will ultimately wither away and we can move away from it. One thing that's going to take fucking a long ass time.
Generations.
Yes. But I just don't see a path where that's not a part of it.
It's about There's two things here. One is that it's about possible versus feasible, right? A different organization is certainly possible. In fact, Parenti talks about it in this very section and on the next page. Like, here's a possibility, right? The pure socialists are not entirely without specific agendas. After the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, an ultra-left group in that country called for direct worker ownership. There would be a syndicalist denial of the necessity of state power, right? Under such an arrangement, however, the revolution would not have lasted 2 months because guess what? We fucking funded the Contras to go and blow them up.
Yep.
On the very next page, right? Let's get real fucking historical, right? When he quotes Engels. Okay, this is talking about in Spain in 1872.
Yep.
The anarchists seized power and they set up their own little fiefdom, which, first off, I don't know if we're really too anarchist if you're setting up your own little warlordisms. But anyway, Engels says each town acted on its own, declaring the important thing was not cooperation, but separation, thus preceding any possibility of combined attack against bourgeois forces. It was the fragmentation and isolation of the revolutionary forces which enabled the government to smash one revolt after the other. It's like stronger together, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You need that cooperation. But there's another parallel that Parenti even makes here, and it's Lenin, right? He says in the beginning, Lenin favors broad organization, broad coalition, right? A mass support. But then later on, it's so funny the way he says, Lenin is an anti-worker. He's just anti-opposition. So earlier we talked about Lenin, and it's saying that Lenin was in favor. He was anti-terrorism, right? He was in favor of broad coalitions and whatnot. But then here on page 55, the same Lenin who had encouraged the practice of internal party democracy and struggled against Trotsky in order to give the trade unions a greater measure of autonomy, now called for an end to the workers' opposition and other factional groups. The time has come, he told an enthusiastically concurring 10th Party Congress, to put an end to opposition, to put a lid on it. We have had enough opposition. It's like, that's enough of that. That's enough of that.
That's funny. I wrote Mao next to that too,
Really?
because I was like, it just had in my mind, like, when is the appropriate time to have an oppositional attitude toward the mass line, the central tenets?
Yeah. The internet argument I've heard is that, is there more than one working class? Then why would you have more than one working class party? I don't know if I agree with that, but I'm dubious of the one party system. I don't know how I feel about it overall, because I just don't know.
I've really come around on the idea of the state.
You're the Stalinist here.
Apparently, I think the important thing is to have mechanisms in place. Like, I don't love this characterization of Lenin. It was like, we've had enough of opposition. I do think that there is a time where, like, you have to move forward despite oppositional attitudes if you want to make any sort of forward progress. But I hope that there is a democratic mechanism in place that still makes those oppositional attitudes and forces a part of the conversation and not just something that's like put under the boot, because we don't need that sort of shit in our lives right now.
I think that Mao is a good example of that. And I think that Lenin probably would say something similar, because they're both preaching for democratic centralism, right? They're preaching for that kind of debate initially, but then once the conclusion has been met, it's like, move on, right? Same thing with unity criticism, unity. It's like there is time for there to be opposition. It's just that the forward-facing political goal has to be one firm fist, one strong hammer or something. I don't know what the fuck that's from, but yeah.
I will say, while I was reading this section, I did feel a little bit attacked at one point at the bottom of page 51.
Okay.
I was like, yeah, these pure socialists, I'm not like them. And then at the bottom of 51, he writes, the pure socialists see socialism as an ideal that was tarnished by communist venality, duplicity, and power cravings. The pure socialists oppose the Soviet model, but offer little evidence to demonstrate that other paths could have been taken, that other models of socialism, not created from one's imagination, but developed through actual historical experience, could have taken hold. And I just had flashing through my mind at that time all of the anti-Stalinist sentiments that have run through my brain. And I was like, oh, I guess I am maybe a little bit like that.
Well, I think the whole spread there on 52 and 53 is a really interesting section, because he's talking about that thing. It's like, why do we always chalk it up to a failure of the leaders? In our like purely ideological minds, it's always like a failure of the leadership. They should have just trusted the workers, right? They should have gone for more democracy, more direct control, more of this and that. And it's like, is that the case, though? It's easy for us to say that on a gut level because we're trying to live these ideals. Mm-hmm. But I really love the quote at the top of 53. It occurs to me that when people as smart, different, dedicated, and heroic as Lenin, Mao, Fidel Castro, Daniel Ortega, Ho Chi Minh, and Robert Mugabe, which really gave me a chuckle because, I don't know, I grew up thinking he was a dictator, which maybe he is.
I couldn't say.
And the millions of heroic people who followed and fought with them all end up more or less in the same place. Then something bigger is at work than who made what decision, at what meeting, or even what size houses they went home to after the meeting.
Yeah.
These leaders weren't in a vacuum. They were in a whirlwind.
Boom.
And the suction, the force, the power that was twirling them around has spun and left this globe mangled for more than 900 years. And to blame this or that theory or this and that leader is a simple-minded substitute for the kind of analysis that Marxists should make.
Yeah.
That's a hit.
Yeah, that comes from Tony Febo.
Tony Febo.
Febo?
I don't know who that is.
I don't either. He wrote in The Guardian also, which is wild that this
Yeah.
is published in The Guardian. Both of those block quotes on these facing pages are
Yeah,
great.
I love the human nature one, too.
Yeah.
That's one thing I'll say. Earlier, I was complaining about his sources. So much of what he cites here is from newspapers, you know, from... I think I like that. It kind of reminds me of imperialism, where Lenin was quoting all these bourgeois economists. Even in the left anti-communism section, though, he says, like, you know, center-right conservatives make stronger analysis than these quote-unquote leftists do.
Your point about Parenti's sources is a valid one. He's not coming from this as a member of the intelligentsia or something like that. He's using popular sources to make these arguments and formulate this whole kind of through line, which is part of what I think makes it so accessible, because he's not mired in theory. You know, he does use words like lumpenproletariat from time to time or whatever, but he's not mired in that sort of theory in a way that is making it inaccessible.
Yeah. No, I think there's definitely something about the accessibility, not in this book in particular, even though I do think it's an accessible book, but there's a lot of his speeches that I think anyone could listen to.
He's an engaging speaker too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sam is adamant that anyone could listen to Rambo and the Swarthy Hordes, which is a fantastic lecture from him about fucking super patriotism. You know, he rails against American empire and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I also just love the way he speaks. One thing I'll say is that he's not a Stalinist. He makes that clear. He's very critical of some things that Stalin did. On page 57, he has a list of some things, right? The exigencies of revolutionary survival did not, quote, make inevitable the heartless execution of hundreds of old Bolshevik leaders, the personality cult of a supreme leader who claimed every revolutionary gain as his own achievement, the suppression of party political life through terror, the eventual silencing of debate regarding the place of industrialization and collectivization, the ideological regulation of all intellectual and cultural life, and the mass deportations of suspect nationalities.
Quote, suspect nationalities.
Yes, quote, suspect nationalities. By that, by the way, he means Jews, okay? Sorry, but that's something I've learned horribly, is that every Soviet leader had some crazy anti-Semitic policy. For better or for worse, they allowed, some of the only people allowed to immigrate out of the Soviet Union were Israelites, were Jews to Israel, okay? Most other people were not allowed to leave the country except for a strictly regulated reason. It's brutal. Talk about a fucking chimera, dude. The Soviet Union is the enigma, right? It's insane. I guess it's just it's like siege socialism again, right? Like that's just what is at the end of this fucking, they burned as bright as they could for 70 years. And what was at the end was something horridly fucked up, you know?
Talking about Stalin was the next thing that I thought made sense to talk about
Sure.
here. And because I agree that I think Parenti takes a very even-handed look at Stalin, where, especially as someone from the West, I think it was very welcome. I wouldn't say that he's bordering on apologia or anything like that. He is definitely like reasonably critical of Stalin while also acknowledging the reality of what Stalin did for the USSR and how he staved off the fucking rise of fascism in Europe. And he says quite a lot about that.
I think he's even willing to take a critical eye against those critics too. I love the section where he talks about gulags. That's a great one because we've had a little discussion about gulags.
Yeah, and purges as well.
Yeah. Here's hard numbers, by the way. The total population of the entire gulag as of January 1939 was 2,022,976, which is a bunch of people. Okay, I can't lie. About that time, there began a purge of the purgers, right? Suddenly held responsible for the excesses of terror, despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. Now, one thing to note is that these were not death camps; they were labor camps. Okay, a crazy statistic, though. In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released.
The archives reveal that more than half of all the Gulag deaths occurred during the war. Oh, this is interesting. Did you weren't getting, you hadn't gotten to
This, I had stopped before I got to this, but I did underline that part. Half of all Gulag deaths for 34 to 53 occurred during the war years.
Yeah, mostly from malnutrition, which when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population.
Yeah.
Some 22 million Soviets died during the war. I think that is an important number to keep in our mind.
Yeah. When Parenti says that the Soviet Union was devastated by World War II, he was not fucking joking.
Yeah.
Okay, their industry was obliterated except for what they had purposefully built on the eastern side of the Urals because they suspected invasion. Oh, how prophetic, by the way. It's like, wow, we built all these factories, and guess what? They came to fruition. But they lost 1 in 3 of their adult male population, okay? That's crazy. That's crazy. Go count 3 of your friends. Shoot one of them.
Don't do that.
Maybe do that. No, but that's what I'm saying is like, you want to talk about siege socialism. I at least personally believe that they came out of World War II maybe irreparably damaged, ideologically. I've read so much about the Soviet censorship having to do with the image of the Great Patriotic War, On Hakim's recommendation, I read a bit of Unwomanly Face of War, and the author talks about that exact thing, where she was trying to get the book published, and the censors were like, we can't have the image of this war reduced because it's such a pivotal, point. It's such a part of our culture. That's understandable. I mean, that happens to a lot of places, right? Think of it as like a national myth. Everything that came before the World War II was cleansed in the fire of war, right? Everything that Stalin did was, at that point, meant to lead up to the defeat of the Nazis. And that's the image that they were able to maintain. And the same thing happens. I mean, in France, there's a movie called like The Horror and the Sorrow that was banned because it talked about the rampant collaboration between Vichy France and the Nazis, And I think it was even Charles de Gaulle who said like, if the French people knew the level of collaboration that France had with the Nazis, they could not continue to exist as a state. It's like these national myths are so important to the fiber of their being. I think that the Soviet Union was really mangled when they came out of it, and it sincerely affected the rest of their life as a country.
Yeah,
Exactly. Especially in their foreign policy. I mean, you can see it in Khrushchev's brinksmanship. You can see it in Brezhnev, who wanted to seek peace through strength, right? That military buildup was an afterthought of World War II. It was a continuation of the same kind of imperialist, capitalist, socialist paradigm that Stalin adhered to when he built that military industrial base.
Yep.
It's fucked. I mean, and I've talked about that before in other places, how the socialism that exists today is one that has changed, right? I said that North Korea is a mangled monster of ideology because it is.
I'd like to learn more about North Korea. I don't know a whole lot about it.
I would love to read a little more about it, mostly because they're just so fucking maligned in our...
Yeah, anything that is attacked so viciously, I am inclined to believe has reason to be supported.
That's so fucked, though. I hate that. And I'm not like, shame on you, but like, that's not the position I want to be in. I don't want to just oppose what they support and support what they oppose, because that's fucked. I mean, it's exactly that thing earlier with Robert Mugabe, right? Where I've been taught that Robert Mugabe is this horrid dictator in Zimbabwe who ruled the country authoritarianly for the last 30 years, and here Michael Parenti is saying he's a revolutionary leader. When I looked into it, he sure as shit did. He sure as shit did do revolutionary shit as a Marxist against the fucking Rhodesians, which were cracker-ass colonizers. Okay, so who am I to believe here?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be both. It started as one went to the other. But either way, how much of that new image is anti-communist malignment?
It's just not a zero-sum game. It's not a fair game.
Yeah.
It's just not a fair game.
It's not a fair game. It's true. They go low, we go high, as Michelle says.
Back to Stalin for a second.
Yeah.
He opens this chapter, Stalin's Fingers. I mean, it's called Stalin's Fingers with this anecdote, and I just couldn't get fucking over it.
Yeah.
So the question of like how many victims this section is called, and Parenti tells us that we've heard much about the ruthless Reds, talking all about Stalin and all of the terror and repression that he's perpetrated.
Yeah.
Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule vary wildly. Some will say 5 to 7 million, some 7 to 8, some 19.8 million just from 1935 to 1940. So the numbers are wild.
I love what I kept laughing about is just the way it keeps going up and up and up. It's like, 5 to 7 million, 7 to 8 million, actually 9. You know what? Maybe 20 to 25 million. Actually, as William Rushler says, 100 million people wantonly murdered by communist dictators.
And then he tells us this story about Churchill on 78.
Yeah.
Okay, before that, he says, like, the reason you get all of those numbers is because there is no reliable way to know. And so people just use whatever agenda they want to use to give the number that they want to give. And then he tells us this anecdote about Churchill. We're fed anecdotes such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded without benefit of a clarifying follow-up question that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. That's just fucking crazy.
Yeah.
What's your source? Stalin going like this.
I don't know. Like literally that fucking Neil deGrasse Tyson meme where he's like,
Exactly.
but it's like, 10 million people.
To this day, Western writers treat this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. That's just fucking crazy.
Fucking so stupid.
I'd never heard that, by the way, also. So before reading this, I'd never heard of that.
No, I hadn't either. Just to continue this, right? On page 81, communism is gone, right? When the communist states were overthrown, where were these half-starved hordes pouring out of the internment camps? I love where he says, if these numbers were true, then a third of the working population would be jailed. Here's a fun fact, is that that was part of Glasnost, or Perestroika, Glasnost, I guess. They released all the political prisoners. I mean, that was literally something that Gorbachev did. He said, all political prisoners, you're good. Go home. Whatever.
Yeah, well, and so on page 80, Parenti gives us all this data about the gulags. He says in the labor camps, he says in 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, it had declined to 3 per 1,000. So like the death rate was in very significant decline. But he tells us that the gulag inmates, he asks, should they be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrests for political crimes or counter-revolutionary offenses numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year.
Yeah.
The vast majority of inmates were there non-politically, for non-political offenses. Things that literally any society would seek to remedy, like murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable by any society. So like this idea of the repressive Reds in the gulag as being like, don't say the wrong thing, you're going to get locked up in the gulag. Certainly 33% of the prison population is too high a percentage of political prisoners, but like to pretend that the gulag was this massive leg of state repression purely for political means
it's the fucking double Holocaust theory again, dude, where the gulag is held up in parallel to the concentration camp, and it's meant to bring the communists down to that same level. When in fact there are completely different things, right? One of them had an express purpose of execution. One of them is non-custodial, labor, right? I mean, not necessarily, but this is on page 78. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials. In addition, whole categories of people who Stalin considered of unreliable loyalty, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, ethnic Germans, were selected for internal deportation. Even though they never saw the inside of a prison or labor camp, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement.
Yep.
So, and I'm not saying like, oh, that's fine, but it's not even fucking prison, And in the case of the gulags themselves, the actual labor camps, the actual prisons, okay, they were not death camps. They were prisons essentially. Another thing, this is mentioned earlier too, but in that death count is literal penal battalions, right? Like prisoners were raised as penal battalions to fight in the war. I'm thinking again of the victims of communism we were talking about earlier. The Black Book of Communism is like the most well-cited thing about it, and it's absolutely ludicrous. They count executed Nazis in the death count. Right? They do like life expectancy mental math. Okay.
Well, and this sort of thing too, like to that point, 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war talking about the total executions that happened in the gulags. He says that these included the White Guard army atrocities, including some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and probable German SS prisoners.
Yeah.
Of course, fucking Nazis got executed.
Right.
Of course, Nazi collaborators got executed.
Yeah.
Because they killed 22 million Russians. And to say, like, look at the numbers, that comes from ignorance or bad faith.
Yeah.
There is no other place
Right.
that it can come from.
It's again the same thing as like what freedoms did they destroy, right? Romania, Bulgaria, and Lithuania all had fucking fascist governments, okay, or proto-fascist governments. There was no democracy there at first, right? The reason they're communist countries is because the Soviets had to march their fucking troops through them at war. I don't know how to feel about any of those leaders, right? History is just a tricky one, Right now, it's easy for me to be like, these guys were great. They were communists at least, but I don't actually know that,
This section was definitely the hardest part of the book for me to get through. I mean, I still enjoyed it and I still found a lot of useful stuff in it, but I don't have a working knowledge of Boris Yeltsin in Russia or Bosnia or,
Right.
Like, these are things that I was alive for a good chunk of it, but I was not. I don't know the history. We're not taught it. I did not learn it.
Yeah.
And so I'm at a loss for contextualizing it in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah.
It's tough.
I've even been having that issue looking for books too, where it's like, if I want to get into a topic that I know nothing about, I don't even know where to start.
I will say, like, this is the section where he was coming back to formerly socialist countries, reflecting on their life in a post-socialist world, in a corporatized kind of economy. And he mentions quite a few things. This is a little Leninism that he does here on 118, where he's talking about Russia and Boris Yeltsin. He says, one report from Russia describes, quote, a bitter electorate which has found life under a Democrat, meaning Yeltsin.
Yeah.
And I love his little interjection there.
Yeltsin.
Is very Lenin-like to me. But he says right under that, the paragraph right under that, state socialism, the system that did not work, quote unquote, provided everyone with some measure of security. Free market capitalism, the system that works, quote unquote, brought a free falling economy, financial plunder, deteriorating social conditions, and mass suffering.
Yeah.
And he even says something very similar to that right above it, where he says, sure, I hear about the new freedom that people are enjoying in Eastern Europe, but how do you define freedom? Millions of people in Eastern Europe are now free from employment, free from safe streets, free from healthcare, free from social security. Oh, that's actually from the GDR defense minister, Heinz Kessler.
Damn.
So yeah, again, I think this idea of freedom and what that freedom actually means is, I don't know, it's just really poignant.
Well, and I think that the long-term effects are still only now just barely being seen. I know we mentioned before how the Nationalist Party is polling highly in former East Germany.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, what happened there? Yeah, here's a quote I love about the changing of the culture even. This is on page 117.
Okay.
This might be what you were looking at with the GDR. One noted Lutheran clergyman commented, "We fell into the tyranny of money. The way wealth is distributed in this society is something I find very hard to take." Another Lutheran pastor said, "We East Germans had no real picture of what life was like in the West. We had no idea how competitive it would be. Unabashed greed and economic power are the levers that move the society. The spiritual values that are essential to human happiness are being lost or made to seem trivial. Everything is buy, earn, and sell." That's a common thread. Something that I really hate reading about is all of these Soviet leaders visiting the U.S. and going to a supermarket and being like, wow, holy shit, look how stocked these stores
Look how many types
are.
of cereal there are.
Well, what's so crazy to me, what's so frustrating to me about all of those anecdotes is that they're like, everybody has access to this. Everybody has access to this. And it's like, no, they don't. The stores are full because not everybody can buy them. That's the thing. It's like, yeah, I'm so glad you see a stack of oranges, but not even everyone has access to that. It's again about that. It's like the equality of opportunity. I think it was Marx or somebody maybe it was Engels that had said this bourgeois society allows for equality of opportunity. It doesn't actually offer equity, right? It doesn't actually offer equality. And that's exactly what it feels like. You know, there's this freedom of opportunity there, but the only people that can actually take advantage of the opportunity are the wealthy, you know, or the moneyed classes, right? The upper class. It's that resolution of the contradiction, but only for the wealthy, right? In fact, you know, that's something I thought about. Sorry to way backpedal, but this is like the first coherent thought I've had in half an hour. Fascism is outdated. Fascism is not necessary. Like, they don't need fascism anymore. They can exercise the same levers of control under modern society. Fascism was a flash in the pan, right? It was like an of-the-moment reaction to pre-existing labor conditions. That's something I like in the beginning when he talks about Mussolini's rise to power, is that the businesses wanted to make these undemocratic changes, but there were already democratic institutions in place. Fascism acted as a means of getting rid of those democratic institutions. In the modern day, we don't need a fascist body to do that because our democratic institutions are already so subverted. You know what I mean? Like, there's all this talk about, like, American fascism, is Trump fascist, da-da-da. It's like, we've been fascist for a long fucking time because our state fundamentally serves the interests of corporations, right? Even, I mean, in every capacity, you know? That's just something that really spoke to me because fascism is outdated. You know, we don't need this crazy strongman ideal because we already have the strongman of the American dream. That's our fucking strongman right there. It's an economic one instead.
The almighty dollar.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, it's just because, like, reading about their rise to power, man, really made me think about it.
It's so baked in, the preservation of corporate interests and the literal personhood of corporations is so baked into the fabric that you're right. We don't need anything more than we already have.
Right.
Like, I agree that fascism is here. I think, like, people think you're speaking hyperbolically when you say that, and they're like, define fascism then. But, like, I agree with that entirely. And what do you need other than the preservation of the current system for fascism to persist?
Right. It's really funny when the Republicans are like, we want Nazism, basically. You know, that's a paraphrase, obviously. But because they don't. They want to conserve the current system, right? And that current system already is full of family values and all of that shit. It's like the fascism is already here. They want nothing but to preserve the modern system. I think it's even in this kind of mercenarial attitude that Parenti mentions here, where he's saying that people don't view themselves as labor, right? They view themselves as like a piece of the corporation to be hired and fired at a whim, you know? And I think that same thing is happening in the newer generations of kids where they're like, I need to work to exist and that's it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like this very roguish attitude almost, you know? It's like this hyper-individualism to the nth degree. I don't know.
All right, cavalcade of quotes. The section where we just go through and read all the quotes that we didn't mention before that we think are dope.
Yeah, it's the cavalcade of quotes.
Yeah, I have a couple. I'm just going to go in order. This is in chapter 1 on page 15. There are 2 quotes here.
Oh, I love this. This was a great bit that we didn't mention about the homosexual SA members.
That's the first one that I was coming at here. Yeah, Pride was and is a protest because he's talking about the SA. He says, in truth, the SA had to be decapitated, not because its leaders were homosexual, though that was the reason given, but because it threatened to turn into a serious problem.
Yeah.
Facts.
I mean,
great.
Yeah. He says in the same chapter, I should say, where on the next page, on 16, the Italian fascists and Nazis made a conscious effort to steal the left's thunder. There's much talk of a, quote, Nazi revolution that would revitalize society. It's another reason they treat fascism and communism as the same because they both have revolutionary principles. Yeah. But the thing is that, like, once that revolutionary current started to make itself noticed, it was discarded because it was antithetical to the business interests, you know, to the interests that supported Hitler. That's something that we were really quick to glaze over, but like the fascists were supported by business, you know, everybody knows that, but nobody does anything about it. In high school, someone from the Siemens Corporation came and talked to us, and I was like, that's a funny name. I wonder what they do. And I looked it up, and they made gas chambers, okay? Yeah. And it's like, wow, maybe this company shouldn't exist anymore, you know? I mean, Volkswagen, right? Volkswagen for the Volk. Yeah. Yes, they're stealing the left's thunder, but that sees the means current was there, and then they had to stamp it out, you know? Yeah, anyway.
The other thing on that page that I just wanted to point out, the bottom of 15, in societies throughout the ages, if able to find the opportunity, women have attempted to limit the number of children they bear. Women are less able to assert their procreative rights if kept subservient and dependent. So I just wrote, abortion is anti-fascist.
Hell yeah. Even above that, where he's saying Himmler saw homosexuals as a threat because the homosexual sissy could not procreate and make a good soldier.
Yeah.
It's like if they're all gay, we're going to die out, dude. It's like anti-Malthusian. God.
Good stuff. And all of the reasons why we should see Pride as what it is, as a celebration of protest and as a part of the protest movement.
What?
And
you mean it's not just a sale at Target? Like,
no. Yeah, I also really love on the next page, like you'd mentioned, fascism offers a beguiling mix of revolutionary sounding mass appeals and reactionary class politics.
the fascists were big on what today would be called family values. You know? Although most of the top Nazi leaders could hardly be described as devoted family men. I'm sorry, I was talking about who funded fascism and crazy shit there in the very beginning about, first off, Hitler had sufficient funds to fight 50 cities in the last 2 weeks of his campaign. That's fucking insane. Okay, I also know for a fact that like Ford and GMC sent 12,000 trucks to assist Franco's Spain, right? When they were fighting the Spanish Civil War.
Well, wasn't it IBM also that with the concentration camps, the primitive computers?
Oh, I don't
used
know.
to punch cards. I'm pretty sure it was IBM.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of threads like that, though. Another great one in the very same chapter. We really skimmed this chapter, but it's a damn good one.
Yep.
I'm glad he starts with it. On page 19, pilots were given instructions not to hit factories in Germany that were owned by U.S. firms. Cologne was almost leveled by Allied bombing, but its Ford plant providing military equipment for the Nazis was untouched. German civilians began using the plant as an air raid shelter. Okay, there's a great book, I can't remember what it's fucking called, about how the Nazis basically fucking modeled their whole shebang on like the Fordist model.
Yeah.
You know, they were looking at American industry and saying, this is pretty good, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Like, holy shit. You know, how mask off can you get? It's not that it's a separate beast. Fascism arises from capitalism. It's baked, it's fucking different flesh on the same bones, you know?
Yeah. Hitler also looked at the treatment of the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved Africans and the subjugation of indigenous Americans, American Indians here as a model. So, you know.
Oh, I love this one. This is a great one on page 37. Have we ever bothered to compare the violence of revolution against the violence that preceded it? Quote, I do not know how one measures the price of historical victories. I only know that the way in which we ordinarily keep the books of history is wrong. We make no tally of the generations claimed by that combination of economic exploitation and political suppression so characteristic of the ancien regimes, the hapless victims of flood and famine. It's just so damn right, man.
Yep.
Yeah. If there was a black book of capitalism, it would be tomes and tomes and tomes, especially if they use the same metrics as the black book of communism.
Yeah, I just wrote murder remains right next to that whole section there. No one is tallying the thousands of nameless victims, like you said. And also to the point about revolutionary violence back on 29, he says the very concept of revolutionary violence is somewhat falsely cast, since most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling for it.
Yeah.
It's a much greater repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchs to maintain the status quo. And I think that goes back to what you were saying in the last episode about envisioning revolution as a defense, as not an offensive measure, but a defensive one. And the violence that ensues comes because the ruling class is using violence to try to shut down that revolution as opposed to the revolutionaries being the instigators of that violence.
Right. Most social revolutions began peaceably. Why would it be otherwise? Who would not prefer to assemble and demonstrate rather than engage in mortal combat against pitiless forces that enjoy every advantage, okay? But that's so real. It's the same thing as like, why would we try to find power among the powerless? It's like, you mean I'm going to wage war against the fucking U.S. Army, dude? Yeah. They have artillery that shoots nuclear bombs. Like, I don't fucking, what do you mean? What do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All great.
Big bangers. Quotes. Big bangers. Stability is a code word for a society in which privileged social relations are securely entrenched.
There is a name drop of the Heritage Foundation writers of Project 2025.
Hell yeah.
A useful modern connection there.
This is a modern book. Nothing has changed in the last 25 years. Yeah. Okay. If anything, it's only gotten worse.
I actually wrote that a couple of times. Like, And this was 30 years ago.
Yeah, like, it's easy to be like, 30 years ago, that was forever. But it really, really wasn't, okay? It really, really wasn't. We've just put on a nicer looking mask, a more smiling mask. Like,
yep. So many banger quotes. I have some that I was like, have to read.
Yeah,
these.
get your
I'm
good
not
ones
read
out.
Every single one.
I don't want to bog you down here.
Oh, this isn't one of those, but I'm going to throw it out because I opened the page. It does have some French in it that I'm going to mess up on page 44. He says, while professing a dedication to fighting dogmatism, both of the right and left, individuals who perform such de rigueur genuflections reinforce the anti-communist dogma that both sides bullshit. Love that. And he does call out Orwell a little bit right below that.
Yeah, I love the idea of the genuflection, right? It's like you can't even start talking about progressive politics without first being like, do you condemn Hamas?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. Yeah, holy shit.
Yeah.
The brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could. Just a little follow-up, man. Last week we read Luxembourg and we talked about the failure of cooperatives briefly, I think also in the cavalcade of quotes. But Gorbachev sought to reform the Soviet economy by introducing cooperatives, and what they did was basically funneled state goods into the export market and then made money off of them. The Soviet economy is a fucking beast, and I don't mean like it's a beast mode. Like, it was crazy. They from what I understand, which is again one book, okay, they had two currencies. They had a cash currency, which civilians could use on a black market, which was that was like the deal they had. They were like, we know you're getting consumer goods on the black market. Yeah. We're focused on other things. So, do what you have to do to make it happen. That cash existed. Okay. But they also had a cashless currency, which is called like Biznal or something. And it was a kind of currency that essentially couldn't be accumulated. And the success, quote unquote, of the Soviet economy was that they kept the two separated, right? You could never exchange cash for state cash. You could never exchange that state cash for regular cash. The problem is that the cooperatives broke that barrier down. Suddenly, there was a way for private citizens to accumulate state cash and turn it into private cash for their own accumulation. Fuck Gorbachev. Okay? Yeah. That's all I'm going to say. Fuck Gorbachev. But he does mention that. So if I want to say that, just for a fact, he says Gorbachev obliterates the economy with cooperatives. This was fact-checked by real Stalinist patriots. True. Okay?
I'm probably not going to fix this in the edit, but about 20 minutes ago, I said, there's a great quote about Germany.
Got it.
I just found it on page 103.
Okay.
Because he's talking about East Germany specifically. And he says, if West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as it forced the East to desocialize, it would be a totally different country.
Yeah, let's talk about fucking denazification for a second, because that's a great one. I always feel like I'm talking out of my ass when I say that, but here's some hard fucking facts. Here it is. It's on page 18 and 19. Just to talk about the difference. After World War II, the Western capitalist allies did little to eradicate fascism from Italy. Okay? They had the Nuremberg trials. Those were pretty bad. I'm not going to lie. I read Devil's Chessboard about Alan Dulles. He had a personal hand in ensuring that many Nazis were shielded from any kind of actual...
We needed them to come work at NASA and do all that shit.
Operation Paperclip aside, they were more than happy to create these lines for Germans to escape Nazi Germany through like Switzerland and then go all over the world, right? Even outside of scientists, we were more than happy to resettle Nazis in a place where they wouldn't be persecuted. Then also, within a year after the war, almost all Italian fascists were released from prison, while hundreds of communists and other leftist partisans who had been fighting the Nazi occupation were jailed. Kind of crazy. The history of Italy in World War II is a little fucky because the Allies were pretty much like, Mussolini was deposed of, basically, and then the monarch came back and was like, we're allies, guys. And thus they were allowed to stay one whole country, That's just a wild one to me. And it's also kind of part of the, the Western plotting in World War II. Germany, for example, was split into 4 zones initially, and then the 3 Allied ones that were not the Soviets combined into one zone, There was a plan for a unified, neutral Germany that the Soviets were in favor of, but it didn't pan out because they clearly wanted to, they being the Western powers, clearly wanted a base of power. Aside from that, now here's the real deal, though. In comparison, when the communists took over in East Germany, they removed 80% of judges' teachers, and officials for their Nazi collaboration. They imprisoned thousands and executed 600 Nazi party leaders for their war crimes. They would have shot more had not so many fled to the protective embrace of the West. There's a wonderful story about, I guess, maybe Yalta or something, where the big three, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, are talking about what to do with the leaders. And Stalin's like, let's just kill the top 50,000 of them or something like that. And Churchill's like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Are you crazy? And Roosevelt's like, let's compromise and kill 30,000 instead.
I just wrote next to that quote you just read on the top of 19, we are not the same. You want to put fuckers in prison, you want to have the world's largest prison population. Okay, that's fine. We are not the same. The people that I seek to imprison or the people that I seek to pay recompense.
To expropriate.
It is a very different situation.
Yeah. And exactly what you said in the beginning of this segment. If they had truly denazified in the same way, we would be talking about a different fucking country. Okay, we would be talking about a different place. Just another bit of history, right? The only reason there was kind of a rapprochement between the Soviets and Western Germany is because Western Germany elected a guy, Willy Brandt, who was a fierce anti-fascist, and he made it clear. And they actually had to dial back some of their messaging about the evils of the Western world because they wanted to collaborate with Western Germany a little. They were like, oh, there's like some political movement that can happen here. And they had to be like, actually, guys, Western Germany is not all Nazis in there. You know, that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point, actually, when he's talking about when Parenti's talking about the deficiencies of communism, and he criticizes their news heavily. He says that there's always glowing internal reports and then scathing anti-capitalist reports. And the problem is, since no one believed one, they didn't believe the other. You know, that's part of that greener grass ideal. You know, even if they were told how shitty capitalism was, they didn't believe it because they thought they were being lied to. You know,
He said something at one point about how Russians in the USSR had maybe a romanticized view of the West, and an unclear view of communism.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I was saying earlier about how they didn't know about capitalism and they didn't know about communism either.
Yeah,
you know,
an unclear definition of communism and a romanticized definition of capitalism.
I love the interview. He's talking to somebody from Hungary who says our socialist system has failed, and he's like, why? And they're like, I don't know. I'm not actually sure, you know? I mean, that's telling, you know? I hate to say it's because of the existence of capitalism, but it kind of feels that way. As much as I want to move into an idea of peaceful cooperation between a socialist country and a capitalist country, a huge part of me is stuck to that same paradigm where it's like they can't exist because one is in competition with the other.
Here's a topical one on 113.
Okay.
Talking about education. Once free is now accessible only to those who can afford the most costly tuition rates. The curricula have been depoliticized, meaning that a left perspective critical of imperialism and capitalism has been replaced by a conservative one that is supportive of, or at least uncritical of these forces. And I just said, that's always what it means.
Yeah. It's neutral. I'm just asking questions. That was a crazy fact. During the communist era, 3 of every 5 books in the world were produced in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Holy shit. That's fucking insane.
Education is not something the communists have gotten wrong.
Yeah.
Cuba is a perfect example of that. Russia, another great example. You want to talk about literacy, you want to talk about education, you look to communist countries.
We were talking about what came before the revolution. The same thing happens in Eastern Europe. The only reason that there's these developed countries there now, besides Czechoslovakia, which Parenti says, is because they were developed by communists, right? Pre-revolution, pre-World War II, they were fucking tooling around in horses and buggies. Yeah. And now they are actual second world economies, at least, you know? Well, now they're fucking third world again. But, you know, they were elevated. They were elevated by the progress of the revolution. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, they not necessarily, right? Poland had a rightist authoritarian dictatorship in place, and they had their own fucking concentration camps. They hated the Jews. They were just as anti-Semitic. Poland's got a big issue with anti-Semitism, as it turns out.
I have no idea.
I don't either. That's a fucked one.
I feel like I'm dominating the cavalcade of quotes, but it's just because this is the spot where I feel like I have something to contribute. There are so many good quotes. I just wanted to point them out. I will say on 124, he makes a point about athletes that was, as a burgeoning young communist, I was like, had come to this same realization. He
Yeah.
says, some professional athletes receive dramatically higher salaries than most people, but compared to the enormous wealth they produce for their owners, and taking into account the rigors and relative brevity of their careers, the injuries sustained, and the lack of lifelong benefits, it can be said they are exploited at a far higher rate than most workers. And I think that that's a really interesting point that is hard for a lot of people to stomach when they're like, Joey Votto played on the Reds for he had a 10-year contract. He made $29 million a year for the Reds or whatever it was. And it's like, how can you look at a millionaire like that and talk about him as an exploited worker? But there's something to be said about the amount of money that he brought into the organization, the amount of money he made for the owners of that organization, and how little of that revenue he was actually earning. Plus the fact that he didn't even get to finish his 10 years because he was injured and they didn't renew his contract in the final year. And so it's like, there's something to be said there. And I think it's important for us to think about that.
I really like that, and this is not my wheelhouse, but even if we want to take it in like a more fundamental tone, right? Think about the discussion about whether college athletes should be paid, right? Especially if you're thinking about what the means of production in that sense are. It's their bodies, kind of. I mean, that's a little wishy-washy, right? But that's the thing, is that they are generating massive. I mean, sometimes like the only thing a college has really going for it is its fucking sports program,
Look at how much money OSU funnels into their football program.
The Ohio State University, which, by the way, highly lots of connections between them and Epstein. Just wanted to say, right? I've driven past the Leslie Wexner fucking art gallery here. Yeah. Anyway, but I'm thinking about like college players that can't use their likeness, right? Like they're banned from even using their own likeness for a commercial purpose. Like, tell me that they're in control of the means of production, quote unquote. I know that this is a really weird metaphor, but like it's there.
Yeah.
That's the same thing. So it's easy to thumb your nose at these like multimillionaires or whatever, but another side of that is how many of them are still multimillionaires? 6 or 7? Shaq and Friends, like
Shaq and Friends.
Yeah, that's fucked.
Yeah.
I like that one a lot.
Yeah.
I like that one a lot. In fact, I will say, just to say, we didn't really discuss that much of Chapter 8, but if you were to just read Chapter 8, I think you would have a really, like, it lays some really lovely groundwork on the fundamentals of Marxism altogether, especially 122 to 125, where he's saying some durable basics.
Yeah, there are a lot of bangers in this chapter, even though we didn't talk about them a whole lot. He's talking about the downgrading of the workforce, I think a precursor to the gig economy that we now are facing. I think he was very prescient with that. He's talking about, under the section of holistic science, about how everything is commodified.
Let me find
We didn't talk about the climate at all.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something we need to get to.
Yeah.
Sorry to break the format, but I did forget about that one. What I was really thinking of, this is my favorite quote of Chapter 8, okay? On 123 at the bottom, I even bookmarked it. He says, "The wealthy few live off the backs of the impoverished many. There can be no rich slaveholders living in idle comfort without a mass of penniless slaves. No lords of the manor who live in opulence without a mass of impoverished landless serfs. So, too, under capitalism, there can be no financial moguls and industrial tycoons without millions of underpaid and overworked employees."
Yep.
That's something that I don't even think we've really commented on that much. I mean, obviously we have, but not in this way. It's not just that there are two classes, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and it's not just that those two classes are connected, but that they are literally in creation of one another, right? The existence of the wealth is what creates the existence of the poverty, because one, it is almost zero sum in that sense. Like, one is extractive of the other. It's not just this idea that there are two classes which people are flitting in between. It's the idea that like the creation of the wealthy creates the impoverished. That's such a powerful message that I think a lot, even like the texts we have been reading, don't necessarily make that necessarily as clear as I think Parenti does in that one paragraph.
I would agree.
I think that one's really great. If you don't want to read this book, fucking read Chapter 8. That's really all I got there.
Yeah, but also read the whole
Read
book.
the whole book!
Not to skip ahead to, was it worth reading? But let's talk about the climate.
Yeah, let's talk about the climate. It's how Parenti ends this book, and because holy fuck, I've put myself out there as a climate communist already, part of the EPA Gestapo, as he says in here. But goddamn, man, even how he starts this section on page 154, Eco-Apocalypse, a class act. In 1876, Marx's collaborator, Friedrich Engels, offered a prophetic caveat. Let us not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human conquest over nature. For each such conquest takes its revenge on us. At every step we are reminded that we by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside of nature, but that we, with flesh, blood, and brain, belong to nature and exist in its midst. It's that same thing, like every action that we take has a reaction, right? Nature, I love the way he says that nature is taking its revenge on us, you know? Just to go back earlier, when he quotes Nixon and saying, a human is such an odd creature that befouls its own nest. It's like, this isn't an accidental thing. These choices are prefigured by the system we live in. These people don't have a choice other than to exploit the natural world to the point of its own destruction. That is the option given by the system.
Yeah, that Nixon quote is on 156, and he says right after that, exactly what you just said. It is not true that the ruling politico-economic interests are in a state of denial about this. Far worse than denial, they are in a state of utter antagonism toward those who think the planet is more important than corporate profits. I don't think it's a mistake that he closes the book with this section for a couple of reasons. One, because I think he's trying to leave you with a pressing concern that should spark you into action. It's a call to action, so to speak. And two, he's also, and he writes about the burgeoning eco-terrorist rhetoric that is coming up at the time that he wrote this, where, people in like the Earth Liberation Front, for example, are being labeled as domestic terrorists and being charged as such in this ramping up against the kind of activism against this kind of destruction of the planet that they were seeing at that time and has only gotten worse in the interim. I don't think it's a mistake that he's like writing about it so passionately because he's seeing it all unfolding at the time that it's happening.
I mean, just to speak broadly, like what we've seen in the modern history of capitalism is capitalism butting heads with these contradictions and then creating some means to overcome them, right? Creating some means to
it adapts.
Yeah, exactly, right? And the thing is that this is a contradiction that cannot be overcome. This is a limit that cannot be crossed, because crossing the limit means the destruction of the ability to do these things, That's what's so fucking pressing about it. It's like, this is truly the existential crisis. And like, I know that sounds so fucking doom and gloom because it is.
And
it is. But it's true. It's true.
Yeah, I think to call all the way back to our very first episode, I've always had a very kind of straightforward approach to politics. I'm not a particularly well-educated person, but I see a very clear contradiction at the heart of the way that we are living our lives right now, which is that you cannot have an infinite growth on a finite planet. And this is where imperialism comes from, because once you exhaust your resources and you exhaust the exploitable masses in a particular region, well, then you have to use military strength to move out of that region so you can have more resources and more masses to exploit. But that is also not an infinite thing. You can't do that infinitely. Eventually, you're going to run out of fucking land.
Right.
You're going to run out of places and people to exploit. It's very simple. Yeah. There is a hard end to what we can do. And I don't understand why people pretend as though like it's not a pressing existential issue.
Earlier, one of those three things is when Parenti says there's no great mystery to feeding people. There's no great mystery to running a health clinic. There's no great mystery. It's the same thing is applicable here. We can see clearly what's happening. There's no great mystery as to why the world's being destroyed. The answer to that question is the challenge, though. And capitalism doesn't have the answer. It is burning us alive.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've been crossing points of no return since I was born.
That's the mark of being a millennial or a post-millennial, is just a
post-millennial.
Whatever you want to call it.
The postmodernist, post-structuralist, post-Marxist.
It's just like crisis after crisis after crisis and point of no return after point of no return.
I hate generation debate, but like that truly is the difference, is that millennials had a glimmer of hope in the beginning. Gen Z has not, We're going through the same issues. It's just that millennials started out going, "Woo, this will go great for us." Gen Z has not had that issue.
They've not been cast under that delusion.
Right. They know better right off the bat. It was told to them because they have millennial parents who are all fucking irony soaked.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, that's it, man. God.
So, okay, it's been a couple of episodes since I've made an allusion to punk rock music.
Please, I would love to hear more punk recommendations. I actually listened to like a good chunk of the This Is Propaganda radio.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Dope.
Yes.
They're recording their new record right now. I'm very excited. They don't put out records often. Yeah, okay, so punk rock allusion of the episode. There's a really great band, really I would say the first big leftist band in punk rock that was really pushing the politics into a radical
Rage
direction.
Against the Machine, right? No, I'm sorry, I'm just fucking with you.
I might have mentioned them before, but their name is MDC. Originally, it stood for Millions of Dead Cops.
That's right.
Their second record, the one that I have in original press of the 7-inch, no big deal, is called Multi-Death Corporation. And on Multi-Death Corporation, he says, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the rest of you.
Yeah.
And Parenti says something very similar on page 158 when he's talking about the climate crisis. He says, immense and imminent gain for oneself is a far more compelling consideration than a diffuse loss shared by the general public. And I just think that is very apropos.
Yeah.
Also, you should listen to MDC. Dave Dichter, one of the great frontmen of all time, one of the first openly queer folks to come out in punk rock and challenge
Hell yeah.
big-headed idiots like HR and Bad Brains and all of their homophobic bullshit. So also, day one leftist, day one radical. Love Dave Dichter. Listen to MDC.
Hell yeah. To hit that quote, though.
He's vegan, too.
Oh, sick. To hit that quote, though, it goes back to what we were saying about how the choices are prefigured, right? When he's talking about cars, right? There's an immediate need for transportation, regardless of like our understanding of the long-term effects of cars, which everyone is well aware of.
Yeah.
Except maybe deniers. Right. The need is that I must own a car. You know, I mean, I'm from Atlanta originally. MARTA goes to 7 places. And if you're cool enough to go to one of those 7 places, congratulations. Otherwise, good fucking luck. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like you better own a fucking car. Here is much the same. I mean, I haven't ridden Gerda or anything, but...
Well, I think that there is, like, he talks about a car culture that is tied in with the kind of rugged individualism that we're bred into, this idea that, like, we are the masters of our own destiny, and therefore, like, need to be in control in all those sorts of ways. But also the way our cities have been planned, big air quotes, has been created as a way to make us need cars.
Right. Yeah.
GM need that money, you need a car.
I mean, God... I was just thinking of Firestone, which is in recent times a company that has fallen out of the limelight, but like they're ghoulish, hellish, evil fuckers. You know, they like single-handedly colonized Liberia, basically.
Really? I don't know anything about this.
It's ghoulish. I'm almost certain we should read that book, the Immergluck book about how to hide an empire. That one has crossed a bunch of times, but I think Liberia's in there.
Yeah. I'm already like 100 pages into that, so it'd be easier to jump into.
There you go.
Because it's a thick boy.
I need to get it.
Okay, that was Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti.
What questions did you have?
I have like some very specific esoteric questions about the history of Russia that this brings up for me, or even just like communism in Europe and Eastern Asia in general, because that is a huge gap in my knowledge. That the whole section where he's talking about Gorbachev and Yeltsin and all of that, I'm just at a loss. So my questions are, what do I need to know to better understand that section of this book?
I think that's a fantastic question. Like I said earlier, I'm kicking myself. If I had known that it was going to be so intertwined with this book, I would have tried to finish Collapse so I could speak a little more fluidly on it, besides the fact that Gorbachev is a big idiot and Yeltsin was a fucking Nazi.
Yeah, my question is about Russia. I don't know enough about the history to make sense of that, so.
Yeah. My questions are kind of in a similar vein. For one, what other contemporary leftists can we read? I know that's not a question directly related here, but will a real leftist please stand up, okay? That's what I need to fucking know, man. It ain't Noam Chomsky. You know, I can name one other Marxist in, like, current left politics. Not politics, but, like, in the leftist intellectual sphere. Yeah, and that's Richard Wolff.
I thought you were going to say Zizek.
Joe Zizek, yeah. I have actually a book. It's called Lenin 2017 by him, where he reflects on Lenin. I need to read.
Later.
Yeah,
that's dope.
Yeah, there's a lot. He does a lot. He's also featured in one of the books I have about Yugoslavia. So
your question is an excellent one for which to solicit feedback from the audience.
Yeah.
What modern leftists should we be reading for this? Send us a message at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Hell yeah. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Let us know. If you're a fellow Parenti head like us, who else has enthralled you, so to speak? I think this is a great piece. I think you should read this.
Yeah, that is the next question. Was this worth reading?
Hell yeah. Yeah. Not that anyone not communist is probably listening to this, but if you're like a liberal and you plan on reading this, don't give up. That's all I have to say. Because I feel like it might be easy if you're a normie. I shouldn't say normie. If you're a normal person, if you're a regular... What the fuck? Now I just sound like an asshole. If you're an everyday American and you...
If you want to come with your fucking plebeian literature...
If you want to open your eyes, sheeple, just read it. Just read it, okay? Just read it.
I think it's an excellent book if you are like, I am sympathetic to everything that I hear that comes from communists or anarchists or something like that, but I don't understand any of the theory that they tout all of the time. And every time I ask them questions, they just say, read the theory. This is a great book to start with.
Yes. Here's a question I have, and I don't want to punch left. The question is, where did you get this information? Okay. That's just a question on my mind. Thinking about the Yugoslavia book, like I would love to go back and fact check that book. The problem is that there's no actual point except for my own self-indulgence. You know, it solves nothing. Yeah. And the same thing here. Like, it's easy for me to be dubious about some of the claims that Parenti makes just because I don't know, I'm skeptical. But what's the point of, I mean, fact checking them isn't going to do anything for me. You know, it's only going to make me like or dislike Parenti more. I don't know. I hate to be so pedantic about it, but I really wish that I could follow up. You know, there are books and like newspapers I can, but that doesn't give me sourcing information. You know, I don't know.
I don't either. Well, next up, we're going to read
Wage, Labor, and Capital. It's by Marx.
It's time for us to read Marx.
Yes.
We've read zero Marx.
Zero Marx, except connected to Engels. So Marx time.
Yes. Hey, thanks for joining us on this epic journey.
Holy shit.
Through Parenti.
Michael Parenti, if you're hearing this, I love you. That's all.
Bye.
Take it easy.